Thank you very much, Zhendong. It's my pleasure to welcome Jeffrey Schott, who I hope has had enough time to prepare his remarks and be ready. I'm confident he has, from the Peterson Institute, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
If I just might make a very brief announcement. I noticed, which is very good, many people were taking photos of the slides, and for tweeting purposes, that's great. I just want to make sure everybody knows that the slides and presentations will be available online. So it's not a now or never as far as getting the information from the slides, but of course there are many reasons for tweeting and so on for taking photos. So please, thanks. Sorry for the interruption.
Good morning. As was said earlier this morning, my presentation has dramatically changed as a result of the events of this week. I was planning to tell you how the Trans-Pacific Partnership was going to succeed and move forward this year, and with incentives that would encourage the president-elect to buy into it early in the next year so that it could enter into force in 2017. But being a realist and experienced in Washington for the past 45 years, I hedged my bets and so titled my presentation, "Will the United States Invest or Divest from Asia-Pacific Economic Integration?" And now I can clearly tell you that the answer to that question is yes. And that is actually much more optimistic than what you are hearing today and around town and around the world about the prospects for a Trump administration. But it does mean that the paper that I wrote on this will not be available online because it's a little bit overtaken by events. Actually, I should keep this because I'm going to take the part of this and twist it around into something that's a much more positive scenario. So let me begin. The first thing that needs to be said is this session was originally called a dialogue on Asia-Pacific economic integration. And there's a perspective that has been underemphasized about what economic integration is about, particularly in the 21st century. In my view, economic integration is primarily about investment. And that gives you an indication of why so many agreements are being directed in the way they are, and why new emphasis is being placed by developed and developing countries. For rich countries like the United States and the European Union, Japan, economic integration arrangements, whether you call them free trade agreements or economic partnership agreements or whatever, they are about securing access to overseas markets and protecting embedded technology so that there is security to invest and produce and source overseas. This is why there's been a greater emphasis on the protection of the intellectual property that is a major capital asset of companies that engage in trade and overseas foreign direct investment. But you have competition for good projects, and so donor countries compete with each other for good projects. And that was less of a problem when it was just the United States and the European Union going around the world investing. Now it is a multilateral issue. And I will get back to this point because this is really what is happening now in Asia and the evolution of Chinese policy. But what has been underappreciated, particularly in Geneva, at the World Trade Organization, is that Economic integration and investment is important for developing countries, and they are engaging in economic integration arrangements to help attract foreign direct investment as a means to help finance their development and to help import technology and import management skills. This is a key component of their economic development strategies. So if you go to Geneva, developing countries say investment is off the agenda of the World Trade Organization. It was kicked off at the ministerial meeting in Cancun in September of 2003. But if you go into the real world, outside of Geneva, then you see developing countries like Vietnam and Malaysia and others saying, we need to get into integration arrangements that are very comprehensive, that include strong and binding obligations on investment, and other domestic policies that can distort the ability to invest and succeed in their market in order to attract investments. And so why is Vietnam a member of the TPP? Why did it sign the TPP, even though it has to turn its economy literally inside out over a period of 10 or 15 years? Because there is no way they can compete with China if they don't do that. And the investment won't go to Vietnam, it'll go somewhere else to another country that has more beautiful policies. It's a beauty contest. Who is creating the most beautiful environment for investment on a sustainable basis, which means it has to benefit the workers and provide possibilities for future growth. But that's the view. And I've talked to the very senior leaders of the Vietnamese government over the past several years, and I say, how can you go forward with the types of reforms that the TPP would require? And their answer is, we don't have a choice. We have to, quote unquote, do a China. We have to engage in domestic economic reform to attract the investment. And we can't do it because we're smaller than China, so we can't just rely on our size, the size of our domestic market. We have to have incentives. And we're too poor to build the infrastructure. We need foreigners to come in and help us build the infrastructure. So all of this is about investment. And of course, they realize that these investments are often critical for linking domestic production into regional supply chains. And this is why you see developing countries, several of which have already signed the TPP, and a number of others who are actively interested in joining the TPP. And we'll leave for a moment the prospects for going forward. But it's important to understand this element of economic integration arrangements. Now, for the past 25 years, the most successful economic integration arrangements have been mostly about investment, and those have primarily taken the form of free trade areas. You have lots of other arrangements. You have bilateral investment treaties. Not many are negotiated, or they're negotiated with so many holes that they don't actually affect economic policy. But in the Asia-Pacific region, the economic integration arrangements that have been around a long time, there have been some that have been around a long time, like ASEAN, limited progress. Professor Plummer is actually the expert on ASEAN. He spent years studying it. They take different forms. There are FTAs in Asia, bilateral investment treaties. All of them are basically recognized for the expansive exceptions and modifications and slow pace of transition that mean that governments are essentially agreeing to things and saying, but we'll actually do it later when we figure out when and if we want to do it. And so you don't see changes in economic policies, and therefore what is going to generate the productivity gains that can actually make a difference in economic performance. So as a simple test of an economic integration arrangement or a free trade agreement, is it going to make a change in current policies to allow a country to achieve more efficient production, productivity gains that can then translate into higher real wages? Michael showed you a great chart on who benefits from the TPP. The ones that had the highest percentage gains in GDP are the ones that made the biggest changes in their domestic economic policies. So when you look at what is an effective economic integration arrangement, it's going to have to be much more comprehensive. It's going to have to it's going to have to include disciplines on domestic policies that can distort production and investment decisions in the economy. Much different from when I was negotiating international trade agreements back 40 years ago. Then it was an innovation that you would discuss disciplines on the use of subsidies because the subsidies would distort production. Now, everything that's done in the domestic economy because of globalization can have an impact, can affect production and investment decisions. And that's why you're seeing this expansion of the agenda of international agreements. Now people say, well, you've overreached. It should cover much fewer things. You should just look at the border. But if you do that, behind the border measures, whether it be restrictive government procurement policies or the like, will have an impact and offset any benefits from reduction of border barriers. And border barriers have been reduced substantially during the GATT era and because of the WTO. And because of unilateral liberalization, where countries realized that they hurt themselves as much by having high barriers at the border, and they wanted more competition in the marketplace. So there's a trend to these more expansive agreements, and that's basically the U.S. template for economic integration arrangements. It's not what happens more generally in Asia. In Asia, there are more limited FTAs, especially those, and as I said, replete with exceptions, developed through incremental additions of coverage of goods and services and investment. You look at the ASEAN Economic Community, it's been in the works since the mid-1960s, and they're still slowly getting past the good stage. In fact, they haven't even finished the good stage. So they do not provide the comparable impetus to economic reform, nor a policy environment conducive to investors that is necessary, and indeed is more necessary than ever when you have a very dynamic, living in a very dynamic region like East Asia. So standing pat is a formula for falling behind in the world economy today. And many of the arrangements being developed in Asia are not doing much more than standing pat. And so effectively, those countries are falling behind because they're not pushing the economic reform fast enough. That is true of RCEP. And before I get to the short analysis of TPP, and Mike has done me a great favor by summarizing a lot of it before, there was the consideration, and it's still dominant. In fact, even USTR tried to promote the comparison of TPP and RCEP as alternatives. They're not alternatives. I don't know of any country that considers them alternatives. But RCEP is much more limited and has much less of an economic impact on the region. It basically suffers from three main problems. First, RCEP is a grouping of 16 countries, all of which, basically the 10 members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and countries that have free trade agreements with them. That's a requirement to be in that club. So 10 plus 6. It is ASEAN-centric, and it is designed to help pressure and push for more intra-ASEAN economic integration, which is good. But it is also a limiting factor because RCEP goes only as fast as intra-ASEAN integration allows it to. So it is a big drag on progress towards economic reform more generally. And ASEAN is dragged because it is a very diverse region, and it has some of the poorest countries in the world as its members. Second problem with RCEP is that 70% of the combined GDP of RCEP countries is Northeast Asia, is China, Japan, and Korea. 70%. So if you're going to get anything out of RCEP, it means that Northeast Asia has to make a big contribution. But if you look at the Northeast Asian countries, they're competing aggressively against themselves. They're competing, and competition as well as political frictions are helping to impede progress in RCEP or limit the horizons or prospects or expectations of what will be given in RCEP and what it can do. So that is, we could spend a whole session on that type of problem, but that's another factor. And then the third factor is very simple for anyone who's ever negotiated with India, and that is that India is part of RCEP. And so that is a total drag on the whole process because the Indian government rarely does anything, makes any commitments to significant reform, and when it does so, it then reneges on it. That's true, actually. I'm being a little harsh, but the point on RCEP is to say that RCEP is on balance a positive for the countries in the region and all its participants, but a very limited economic positive. There are political benefits that accrue from the participation as well, but we'll put that aside because we're just talking about economic integration right now. But for those countries that are interested in economic reform because they're concerned about boosting growth, attracting investment, and advancing their development, they're in RCEP, but they also have joined TPP. And 7 of the 16 participants in RCEP have also been signatories of the TPP, and quite a number of other RCEP countries have expressed strong interest in negotiating accession to TPP once the TPP enters into force. So you could see a large number of RCEP countries actually coalescing and participating in both. And indeed, if you're in TPP, then the requirements of RCEP are easy to meet. It's clear that you could have this participation in both, and many countries are doing that. And there's no requirement to do it. They're doing it because it's in their enlightened self-interest. So what is this, what's going to happen, though, with TPP? You have the agreement that was officially signed on February 4th of this year. Since then, countries have begun the process of domestic ratification. Most countries, sensibly, looking at the history of what the United States did with Korea in the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, where it took 4.5 years to go from signing the agreement to getting congressional action on it, have proceeded relatively slowly and cautiously on their own domestic procedures, waiting for the Congress to act. And many thought that the Congress would act this year after the election. And indeed, that was a great expectation ever since the Congress passed Trade Promotion Authority, which extended fast-track procedures to allow expedited implementation of trade agreements, and that was done in the summer of 2015. So there's been an expectation for about 17 months that the Congress would wait until after the election this week to begin its consideration of TPP. The only country that has moved forward more quickly has been Japan, and yesterday the lower house of the Japanese Diet approved TPP implementing legislation. Lower house will follow. So by next month, Japan will have completed its ratification procedures, which is significant. For the U.S., as you saw from my ripped up paper, the strategy for moving forward with, in the lame duck session so that President Obama could work out a deal with Republican leaders of the Congress to allow a positive vote, which would depend on a large majority of Republican members of Congress supporting TPP, because the Democrats do not. That strategy has been put on ice. So TPP is in suspended animation, is the best way to put it. It's not to say TPP is dead. Some people will say that in the press. But at this point, prospects for action in the lame duck session of the current Congress is dead, and it will be up to the next administration. That leads some people to say, well, TPP is dead, because that's what Donald Trump said when you look at his trade platform from the campaign. The #1 item on the list, even before naming China as a currency manipulator, was, I'm going to rip up TPP. So hopefully he's got better things to do on January 20th. Than worry about a trade agreement that is not going to enter into force until the U.S. Ratifies it. So that is a condition of the TPP, and it won't happen. But I find it very odd, because if you think about who is opposed to TPP, it's a rather strange coalition. You have, of course, the labor unions that have opposed almost every trade agreement that has been promulgated in the past, in my life, well, not in my lifetime, but pretty close to my lifetime. And you have Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and to some extent Hillary Clinton, and Donald Trump. They're all in it together. And indeed, if you look at Trump's campaign platform on trade, it's a little bit to the left of Bernie Sanders. And that's not a surprise, because he's drawing on the same flawed economic analysis of another think tank in town, which has criticized Petrie and Plummer in ways that are just indefensible in the economics community. But they just continue. It's like what Trump did during the campaign. And so you have this criticism, which is basically on very weak foundations. And if you sit back and look at the reality of the impact of TPP on the U.S. economy, you think that at some point, people of responsibility are going to act responsibly. And if you look at what TPP means for the United States, you're going to say, okay, well, why is it that every manufacturing law association and services association and farm group, why are they all supporting the TPP? Why are most Republican members of Congress supporting the TPP? It's because of what Mike showed you. There are very strong economic benefits for the United States and for U.S. trading partners. So that's the first point. Second point is there was criticism, well, we need to fix what's wrong with our trade agreements, like NAFTA. Terrible trade agreement that, well, TPP did that. All the major things that the candidates complained was wrong with NAFTA have basically been fixed with Canada and Mexico being in TPP. Almost all. And I'll get to the exceptions in a minute. So the TPP effectively updates and upgrades and augments all of the existing trade agreements in the Asia-Pacific region that the signatory countries are party to. There are lots of holes. It even improves upon the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement that was just entered into force in March of 2012. But there are some areas of TPP that go beyond what was in the Chorus FTA. And as was said earlier, this is because the world has changed a lot from when these agreements were negotiated. And the way you conduct international trade and investment today is far different than you did 20 years ago. You don't get on your cell phone and place orders or book financial transactions. You have a different way of transport. Transportation technologies have changed. Wide differences in production, distribution, marketing, and finance. And those are adapted and incorporated in the TPP. So there's those innovations. And of course, it's important for strategic relations in the region. And it sends very important signals about continued engagement and commitment, not only to defense postures, but to the economic well-being of your trading partners. Because essentially, a country prospers, a country benefits when its trading partners prosper. If you have a trading partner that is growing at a high rate of, a high growth rate, like China has for many years, that's why all of these countries are now have China as their #1 trading partner, because China has been so successful in its economic development over the past 2 decades. You want that to continue, and TPP does that. Now, why do I think this situation is still salvageable? 2 reasons. One, the TPP countries all entered into the TPP because it was in their economic self-interest to do so, because they wanted to pursue domestic economic reforms to improve their growth prospects. Yes, marginal improvements in access to the U.S. market, but the U.S. market was generally open in any event, and U.S. negotiators were not very generous, put it mildly, in offering additional concessions to the other TPP countries in terms of access to the U.S. market. As Michael said, U.S. tariff on autos is 2.5%. It doesn't make much of a difference on trade. But that's not going to be eliminated for 25 years. And it's not going to be reduced for 25 years. It'll take 25 years to, it's commercially insignificant, that reform. So, but the other countries are vested interest and a stake in the reforms that are mandated and encouraged by the TPP. And that's why you see Japan moving forward with its implementation, because this is a strategic part of Abenomics. And so what does this mean? Well, under the terms of the TPP, the other countries, the whole agreement can't enter into force legally unless the United States is a partner. I can go into the details later if you want. But that doesn't mean that the other countries cannot provisionally apply the TPP among themselves, grant the preferences as if the TPP was a legally binding agreement, and keep the door open for moving from provisional application to full application once the United States comes to its senses and goes through the door. There's precedent for this, obviously. You may remember an agreement called the General Agreement on Tariffs on Trade. That was the provisional application of the Charter for an International Trade Organization, which died, which was stillborn in the U.S. Congress in the early years of the post-war period. And yet, everyone else followed the GATT, and the U.S. did as well on a provisional basis for 47 years. Well, hopefully it doesn't take 47 years to finish the TPP, But it is possible for the TPP countries to get together and provisionally apply the agreement once they have all finished the ratification procedures, which they could do next year. And indeed, I suspect that the TPP countries will be discussing that when they're all together at the APEC summit in Peru next week. This is a viable option for them. And of course, what does it mean for the United States? It means that the agreement that the United States led and basically drafted off of the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement would be an agreement providing preferences to everyone else but the United States. And so US firms, investors would be discriminated against in TPP markets. As well, not only by the TPP, but by other free trade agreements negotiated bilaterally. Japan and Australia have a free trade agreement that is going to strongly discriminate against US exporters of beef. But you could find hundreds of examples of where there will be a cost of delay or non-participation. So this, and that excludes what Michael showed you, which was the foregone benefits and opportunities from expanding trade. So not only do you lose the opportunity to expand your production and trade, but you actually could suffer more trade diversion. It just doesn't make any sense, and I suspect that once this begins to sink in to the constituencies who've made arguments, once they start really losing money, their representatives in Congress will hear about it. So the area of optimism for TPP that I will leave you in conclusion is this. Hopefully, TPP is not torn up, but it is just ignored. There's no reason for the Trump administration to do anything about TPP in its first couple of months or 6 months in office. By that time, let the agreement, what I say, marinate. It'll become tastier once they realize that there's a lot of nutrition in what was done in both the Bush and Obama administrations. Thank you very much.